Hello, and welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the basics of law school resumes and cover letters, so that you'll be ready to jump on any interesting opportunities that come up. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the very best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, Bar Exam Toolbox, the Catapult Conference, and the Trebuchet Legal Career Site. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today we're discussing resume and cover letter basics, so you'll have both ready to go when an interesting job opportunity opens up. But before we get into the details, let's talk about a question that comes up a lot. Do law students need a resume and cover letter ready to go, or can they create one when an opportunity presents itself? Isn't it too early to be worrying about all of this stuff? What do you think, Allison?
Well, I would definitely say the time to do your resume and cover letter is sooner rather than later. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is just that if you have something ready, you're going to be much more likely to be able to jump on an opportunity when that opportunity presents itself. And when we talk about opportunities in law school, we're not just talking about jobs. Sure, the perfect job could come up and they could just be waiting for your resume. But it's more likely to be, particularly in your first year, to be something else. For example, it might be an application for summer funding. I remember at my school at that time, if you wanted public interest funding for your first year of summer, you actually had to apply very early. So I think it was October, maybe November. But, if you had your resume ready to go, it's just one less step in the process of getting everything together and jumping on these opportunities. I don't know. What do you think, Lee? I
think that's exactly right. And, one of the things I think we'll talk about in a little bit too is, how perfect your resume needs to be. And, as you get different new activities, or you get elected to an officer of a club, or you get honors in law school, you're going to need to immediately update your resume because you want that stuff on it. And if you have a clean resume ready to go, it's very easy to proof and add to it. So you can be very agile and respond to the needs. Whereas if you say, well, I'm going to wait until I need it to do this resume, one, you might forget things, which is bad, but two, you might not be able to adequately take the time to scrub it and make sure that it's perfect enough to really represent you out in the business world or in your law school.
No, and I think that point about forgetting things is a totally valid one. I remember even when I was working, I can't remember if it was a clerkship or at a firm, but someone said, you should make a note of any major piece of material that you work on. So if you write a summary judgment motion, you should have a list of basically everything that you've done in your tenure at this law firm, because eventually you're going to need that information. And it is so easy. You think I would never forget, that I got this award, or that I, did well in this class, or that I was the president of this club. But you might actually. And so it's much better to have these things updated and ready to go as you go along. Because some other things you might want to apply for, maybe an internship or an externship with a judge, perhaps a research assistant position or a TA position, or even if you do an informational interview with someone where you go and you're talking to them, not necessarily because you think they're going to immediately offer you a job, but just to get information. It's still good to have a resume in that scenario because a lot of people ask for it. And, they're thinking in the back of their minds this person seems interesting. They seem really personable. I like them. I might like to help them. And they'd like to have your information on file. So you want to have that, if not with you, which is ideal, but at least ready to send over within a few hours of them asking you for it.
Mm-hmm. I also think that, starting sooner than later gives you time to get a lot of feedback and make sure that your resume is the best that it can be. Because, if you're not that busy right now, if you're listening to this and it's the beginning of the semester, now is a great time to try and go to career services to talk about stuff like this, because they're not going to be as slammed is probably later in the semester. Or if it takes a while to get into career services, you might have, time to get an appointment. But you want to be able to get feedback on your resume. And if you wait to the last minute, you're not going to really be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think that to keep in mind is there actually are deadlines for a lot of this stuff and guidelines. So, for example, I don't think 1Ls are actually allowed to talk to their career services individually right now. Mm-hmm. Well, right now being in August when we're recording this. But, there's a fairly early, I think it may be like the 1st of October or something, that you're allowed to get one-on-one advice. But this also brings up another point, which is that the job pressure in law school really starts sooner than people often think. For example, if you're a 1L and you're planning on applying for summer jobs, you can start applying for those jobs to NALP organizations. NALP is, I think, the National Association of Legal Professionals or something. But, if you're thinking of applying, we'll go with it. Yeah. Sorry, NALP, if you're listening. But great organization, and they have a website where you can actually search for summer jobs. And you can start applying for those jobs as a 1L on the 1st of December. So that's only a few months after you start school. And let me tell you from personal experience, when December 1st rolls around and you're trying to send out 100 applications to law firms, if that's something you're interested in, that is not a great time in your semester to be devoting serious amounts of time to working on your resume. I mean, I remember, with my roommate in law school, we're sitting there like literally addressing envelopes and putting the stamps on in the middle of when we should have been studying for exams. And it was this moment of what are we doing? But at least I had a resume ready to go. Mm-hmm.
So if you're a 1L and you aren't allowed to go talk to your career services until December 1, how do you think you can get some feedback on your resume before then?
Well, I think basically you ask anyone who seems like they would be a reasonable resource who's willing to help you. So it might be the case if you made friends somehow magically, with like a 2L or 3L who's going to be your mentor, or if you've been assigned a mentor, this is a person that you can ask for feedback. Mm-hmm. I think you have to always be cognizant of whether the person knows what they're talking about. But, if this is someone who's gone through the process of getting a job and they were successful, perhaps they're worth listening to. Yeah. You can ask your friends and family. Again, ideally, it would be someone who's in the legal profession or has some other sort of professional experience. Because, I'm not sure that, my mother necessarily would have any clue what should go in my legal resume. What do you think? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I think, asking your community. So maybe it's a trusted mentor that's outside of the law school world if you came from the business world. Because I think a lot of times business resumes and lawyer resumes aren't all that different. But making sure a lot of eyes get on it. I think that to me is one of the biggest challenges, is especially from a proofreading perspective, from a content perspective, you just want a lot of feedback. You don't just want to get feedback from one 2L that you had lunch with and decided that's the resume you're going to go with.
Right. The other thing I think there's value in is understanding that your resume does not get looked at for very long. Mm-hmm. So even if it's not someone who necessarily is in the legal profession or whatever, just ask, your uncle or your aunt or whatever, your parents, your friends. Just say, can you glance at this resume and tell me what you take away from it? And don't give them 5 minutes to look at it. Literally give them a minute or less. Mm-hmm. Because I think, there's studies on what the average hiring manager, the time they spend looking at a resume, and it's something like 6 seconds.
Oh my gosh, is it really that bad? That's really disheartening.
Yeah, they glance at it. So a lot of this is not, that glance has to give someone enough of an incentive to actually sit down and spend a minute or two with your resume. That's really your goal, right?
Right.
The goal of the resume and the goal of the cover letter is just to get it read, basically.
Yeah.
And, let's talk about that a little bit. So, the point of this is basically you're trying to tell a story. And that story is, why are you the perfect person for this job or this other opportunity? And I think one of the things a lot of law students miss, because they haven't really been in the business world, they probably haven't done marketing, most of them, is you've got to kind of do the work for people. Some people, I guess, they kind of think of resume as just like a list of stuff. It's just like, this is an objective list of the things that I have done. But that's not exactly accurate, is it?
No, your resume really is your presentation of your story and what your experiences are and what you bring to the table. And you have the ability to craft that story in a lot of different ways. Finding those themes that you want to see come through your resume that's going to make you attractive for a certain type of legal job.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I like sometimes to look at it like the things that you've done, and these are not necessarily just paid jobs. I think it's worth, particularly for younger students, we're thinking about things outside of the paid realm. Have you volunteered in a community organization? Have you organized things in your spare time? Do you have a hobby like selling something on Etsy? That's totally valid to put on your resume. So basically you get this whole sort of pool of raw materials. And then just like you're crafting a legal brief or something, you have to craft the story. You have to tell your story. Because the person who's hiring you, well, yeah, they're looking for the perfect person, but they're also just like, okay, this person is like, I don't know anything about them. I don't know that they're a great person. I don't know that they're really hardworking. All I have in front of me are the documents that they're sending to me.
And I think it's amazing what you can pull out of experiences. I think when I graduated from college and I was doing my first round of kind of jobs and I didn't have a ton of work experience, one of the things I always talked about in my cover letter was that I ran my collegiate a cappella group for 2 years. But I didn't just say, hey, I sang in college. I was the music director. I raised money. I organized events for thousands of people. I managed entire groups of students. I was voted into this leadership position. And you can really make, something I did for fun into something that was very attractive to a job because they saw, oh, well, she can work with others. She was, she's a leader. She has organizational skills. She raised money. She knows how to present herself to other organizations to get money. That made me a very attractive job candidate from running a collegiate a cappella group.
Yeah. And I mean, I would buy all of that. I'd be like, yeah, this is great. I mean, for example, with my sister, when she was doing a resume for, I can't remember if it was a job or for grad school, but she had a summer where she went around the country following Fish, the band. And so there was this sort of gap in the resume. And she's like, well, I just don't know what to do. So I talked to her about the sort of details of what she had done and found out that they had, visited various national parks and monuments and things like this. So her summer touring with Fish became summer touring the national parks and monuments of America.
Right. So it's not lying.
It just sounds better. Right. No, it's not lying. It's true.
It's crafting.
Yeah, a friend of hers actually looked at that resume and said, man, your sister's really good at this. Like, none of it's actually untrue. It just sounds way better than it is.
Exactly.
But it's all completely supportable. If they wanted to go back in time and find the receipts for the campground in Yosemite, those exist.
Right. And sometimes, especially when you're coming from a background that's not a legal job or a legal career. So I was coming from consulting. It was my job to pick my story that I could present about why that background would make me a good lawyer. And for me, a lot of it, I decided, was the fact that I had been a client-facing consultant. And so, I managed clients and I managed client relationships. And that is very attractive to a law firm who would at some point want you to manage client relationships. And so when you would read that resume back from that period of time when I was getting those first legal jobs, that was a theme that I chose to have really in all of my consulting jobs. So they would say, wow, she's got a lot of client-facing experience. That's great. And that set me apart from the law school population, many of whom had just come straight through undergrad.
Right. And I think that's one of the key things is to keep in mind, keep the perspective of the person who's going to be reading these materials in mind. So what are their concerns? I mean, you make a great point that your concern, if you're a law firm attorney, is can I put this person I'm hiring in front of a client? Mm-hmm. And if the answer to that question is no, your odds of being hired are basically nil. So, how can you help them? That's one of the things to think about. What do you have to offer in this position? It doesn't have to be a law firm. It could be a professor. So a professor's looking for a research assistant position. What do they care about? They care about someone who's detail oriented. They care about someone who's going to be there when they need them to be there. So these are the kind of things that you can draw out. And it might be that you had a summer job. I don't care if it was working at McDonald's, but that actually shows that you're going to show up every day and you're going to get the work done. Because you want to make it easy to say yes.
Right. So what were things on your resume? How did you spin actually going to architecture school? on your resume? Because I don't think I've ever read your resume, actually, which maybe I should have asked for that when we decided to become business partners. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, if you had, you would have seen that I was an outstanding graduate student instructor for several years in my architecture education. No, I mean, it's an interesting question because I think for me, the resume was probably not the place where I did that. My resume basically started off with education because my education was more relevant and more impressive. And so, you basically saw Ivy League law school, law review, check the box. And then you see, okay, there's this other graduate degree. Here's some activities. You were an outstanding graduate student instructor. You got the scholarship, blah, blah, blah. And so I really focus on the education. I don't think I even mentioned architecture school in my cover letter. Mm-hmm. It was one of those things that it came up immediately in an interview, but I didn't exactly draw attention to it in my application materials.
And, part of this is there are things about your job history that maybe aren't going to be perfect, but, you put them in there and then you have an answer when it comes up in the interviews, and I think that that's really where you just have to be prepared for interviews if you have a gap in your resume or if you have some unique experiences that maybe you've got to explain away. I remember getting called out in a callback once for changing jobs too many times. And he basically, the hiring partner said, well, it doesn't seem like you have much staying power. So how do I know you're going to work for me for more than a year or two? And it was kind of like, that was a totally valid point.
Yeah. No, I mean, the theme of mine was basically academic high achiever, starting with like Phi Beta Kappa, undergrad, highest honors, blah, 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 all the way up to like Ivy League law school. Like, there's nothing to look at here. And even, luckily, architecture school was at Berkeley, which is at least a good name to have on your resume.
Right.
So, and I think that's something to think about is whether you should have your education first or whether you should have your work experience first. And if the schools that you graduated from are not as prestigious, and maybe you haven't done as well there, but you ended up having some interesting work experience, that's something that you probably should consider putting up front. Mm-hmm. One of the questions you can always ask is, what is this organization? And it might vary by organization, but what are they going to find most compelling about my background? Yeah. And that's the first thing that should be at the top of your resume, right?
Yep, 100%. So let's talk a bit more about this first impression, though, because I think that sometimes people really forget that you are making a first impression on paper, and there are so many judgment calls that can be made just by looking at that paper. So these are some of our pet peeves because, we get people who want to work for us sending us resumes. So if you're listening to this and you think you might want to work for us, really listen carefully because these are our pet peeves.
All the secrets right now.
All the secrets are right now. If you have terrible formatting and it looks messy, it's not going to go well for you. I think that that's pretty true for most lawyers and recruiters. Don't you think, Allison?
I do think it's true. And I think that's something that I personally am very sensitive to because I have a design background. And I think a lot of law students don't necessarily see things. They might have an overall kind of impression of like this resume looks better than that one, but they don't necessarily know why. So it's definitely, I think, worth looking at a lot of resumes, a lot of examples. You can find them online, and sort of seeing like which ones seem better, not necessarily what they say, but just looking at them, because that's a skill that you sort of have to train your eye. I mean, for me, things like if someone has something on the left column and something on the right column, oftentimes the right column isn't aligned to the right. Like if somebody has a date or something, that drives me like bonkers because it just looks bad. Like it looks bad. And it's a hard thing to get right, actually, because Word doesn't make it easy. But, these are things to think about. If you're going to have stuff on the left column and stuff in the right column, you have to figure out a way to make sure they're aligned to the left and the right. I mean, this is, it's a detail, but that attention to detail is what lawyers really value.
Right. And can we say it again about typos? Oh my gosh, do not send me a resume with typos. I lose my mind with typos. And I'm a terrible speller. And I still get really angry when people send me a resume with typos because there are no typos in my resume.
No, and there should not be typos in anyone's resume. No. If you send out a resume with a typo or a cover letter, if your cover letter has a typo, if your cover letter does not get the name correct of the person you're sending it to,
or say the firm. Problem. Yeah, the wrong firm name. We always hear that from our recruiter friends.
Yeah, the wrong organization. It's like everyone knows you're doing mail merge, but at least make sure it's right.
Right.
these things aren't that hard, but people screw them up all the time. And the other point here is like that you really want to make it look like you tried. So if you have 2 resumes in front of you and one of them is clearly boiled, and not just resume, cover letters are a great place to make it look like you're really trying. But if you have 2 applications in front of you, one of them is clearly boilerplate, like they've sent it off to 100 different people. And one of them has taken the time to go through what you're looking for and actually explain why they're qualified. Which of those 2, Lee, do you think you're going to hire?
I'm probably going to hire the one that the people put time into, because it makes me feel like they want to work for me if they crafted it just for me.
Right. And I think, sometimes people say, well, there's no possible way I could do that. Like I have to send out 1,000 resumes or whatever to have any chance of getting a job. And there's some truth to that. I mean, it is a numbers game. But you can send out 1,000 crappy resumes and still not have any options. If you send out 10 really excellent resumes to jobs that you are basically qualified for and that you're legitimately interested in, you're probably going to have a much higher rate of return, right?
I think that's true. I think that there is a lot of pressure right now of the more the better. And if I send out 1,000 resumes, then I'm doing everything that I can. But this goes back to a theme that you've probably heard throughout the podcast is it's the hard work that usually gets you where you need to be, or the stuff that, is a bit more challenging or makes you uncomfortable. And oftentimes working these cover letters and researching these organizations and really finding a way that you are a good fit is going to be a lot harder than just doing a mail merge and sticking 1,000 stamps onto things. But or
emails, we don't even have to stamp them these
That's
days,
true,
right?
yeah.
Just
and
spam out 1,000 emails, something will happen.
And they just go into the ethos, But taking a little bit of time and crafting that, I think you're going to have a better rate of return. And just be really careful. For instance, people do send us resumes to work for us, and they call me Mr. Burgess. You think I'm going to hire someone who hasn't yet gone to my website and seen the picture of 2 women who run this company? Like, that is... Probably not. Nope, not going to happen. That just to me shows that you didn't take any time to...
Yeah, and obviously, like, you can't always find, the contact name of the person you're sending it to, but most of the time you can. If you're trying to reach out to a law firm, for example, like they probably have the contact details of their hiring people on their websites. They probably have a section on their website that says, do you want to work for us?
Right.
You can probably get a lot of great information there,
yeah.
Which may or may not be in the NALP directory. So that's a good example of, the sort of slightly proactive student goes to the NALP directory, does a mail merge, calls it a day. The more proactive student goes through the list and says, oh, hiring manager is probably not what I want to have. Dear hiring manager, maybe I can try to find that person. It's those little things. As a dean, yes, it takes longer, but it's going to drastically increase your odds of getting the attention of the person who happens to be an actual person, not hiring manager, that you're trying to reach. Well, let's talk briefly. You touched on this. Do you think you need different resumes for different jobs?
I think it depends on how varied of jobs that you're applying for. I think when I was doing my firm applications, I pretty much just had one resume for all the firms because I felt like it was basically the same job at different firms.
Sure.
But when I did have friends who were maybe applying to government agencies and then private law firms, those government agencies, again, might have a different story might get you more notice in a government agency. Maybe focusing on your volunteer work or the fact that you've done a lot of pro bono work or different classes or awards that you got. So I think it depends on the variety of opportunities that you're applying for. But it's about putting in the time and making your resume and cover letter noticeable to these hiring managers or recruiters.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think if you're simultaneously applying for jobs in a large law firm and jobs at, the ACLU, there's a high likelihood that you might want to emphasize different aspects of your background for those jobs.
Yeah.
And so, if you're doing radically different things, it totally makes sense to have different resumes. I mean, I think cover letters for sure probably need to be different. Not necessarily if you're applying to 100 fungible law firms, fine. It's like, I'm interested in doing litigation at firm X. Great. Fantastic. Mm-hmm. Just make sure they actually have a litigation department before you apply. Yeah. So
one of the things that I remember a lot of my law school friends struggling with who just come out of college was what to do with a resume and cover letter when you have no work experience, or maybe your work experience is just working at Nordstrom over the summer. What do you do?
Yeah, and this is a tough question. I mean, we definitely, have seen some very thin resumes from 1Ls who just literally don't have any sort of real paid experience. I think there are some things you can do. I mean, number one is you probably clearly want to put your education up top and to go into more detail about your education and highlight different activities. And so, just as you did with your a cappella group, think creatively. Like, are there any, presumably, hopefully, you did not spend your entire undergraduate time sitting in the library. Like, were you involved in any sort of activities? And can you spin these activities into something that sounds like leadership, right?
Yeah, and I think summer jobs. You probably had some sort of summer experience when you were an undergrad, and calling on that work experience too. Even if it was a camp counselor, that still can be spun.
Right, absolutely. No, on my sister's resume, there was also a camp counselor at various camps that she had worked at. One of them, she happened to be teaching. So, that got spun into teaching experience in X, Y, and Z. And I think that's the point, is like you probably have done more than you think you have. And so thinking creatively about times where, were you organizing something? Were you managing people? Were you managing money? Were you asking for money? Were you selling something? Sales are a huge, huge concern for most lawyers. And so, even if you were working at Nordstrom over the summer, that's not something you leave off your resume. You have sales experience. That's huge for lawyers.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even when you're in undergrad, did you call alumni and ask them for money, which is one of the things I did as one of my part-time jobs in college. And I tell you, when I went out to the workforce, people loved that because, again, I was asking people for money. That's
calling for money. Like, hello.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I was like hired as to take phone surveys in undergrad, and it's a similar sort of thing. It's like, oh, you called people, you cold called them on the phone and got them to talk to you. That's kind of useful. I mean, if you really have a super, super slim resume and, you didn't do anything in college, you can't think of anything you did in the summer, one option is to pick up some pro bono projects in law school. And these do not have to be a huge time commitment, and you can start working on them even in your first semester. But something like that, even if you're only going a couple of hours a month, if you're working, I did one in family court and another one, Social Security appeals. And these were pretty limited scope, but you can spin it into something where at least it gives you something to talk about if you get an interview. And it also gives you some sort of work experience.
So I've got to share my favorite story, though, for asking for money from my college. So I went to Claremont McKenna College down in Southern California, which used to be Claremont Men's College. And I had my list of alumni. And one night I called an alum when it was Claremont Men's College. And, we had our scripts of what we were supposed to say. And after I made my little introduction, he just said, the worst thing Claremont ever did was admit women. And he hung up on me. And I turned to the supervisor and I said, I don't think he's going to give money to the school anymore. But if you want to call him back, I don't think you should have me do it. Because I don't think it's going to get me anywhere.
Yeah, that sounds like a definite hard no.
It was a hard no, but it was one of more memorable moments of cold calling people and asking for money.
Hey, at least you couldn't take it personally.
I didn't take it personally. Hey, it really had little to do with me.
Or nothing.
Or nothing. Okay, so what about, we've talked a little bit about when your work experience isn't related, how to spin things, because I think that is a big problem. But again, I think the point to make about all of this is this spinning of your experience is not something you can do off the cuff. Like, this is why you got to start and really work on your resume for a while, because sometimes it takes feedback from other people and getting a little creative to make your story work.
Right, because sometimes you'll tell your story. I'll often, if I'm helping someone with a resume, I'll ask them to tell me what they did. And oftentimes, they say, oh, well, it wasn't really related. I was working in, say, a chemistry lab. Okay, well, tell me what you did all day. Well, I did research, and then I wrote up the research, and then I, validated it, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, that sounds like something we can work with here. You're gathering evidence, which is what lawyers do. You're explaining your evidence in writing. That's basically what lawyers do. So there may be these connections that you haven't thought about. And then in that way, it can become basically something that makes you a more interesting candidate. not something that's a drawback. So even though it's not obvious at first glance that working in a chemistry lab has very much to do with law school or being a lawyer, it actually can, those skills are transferable. And the fact that a chemistry lab, everyone knows, is you've got to be very detail oriented and diligent. And so emphasizing those sort of characteristics, suddenly it's not, oh, this person has no related experience. It's like, oh, isn't that interesting? Like, this person has some really interesting experience, and I bet that would carry over to being a lawyer.
Writing reports, reporting back to your supervisors, things like that.
Exactly. I mean, anytime you've ever supervised anyone, even if say you're supervising an intern or something like that. I had a job once where even though I was a temp, they hired several other temps to work under me. So you better believe, supervise 3 people to do X, Y, and Z was on my resume when I started out, because what else was going to go on there?
Yep. What about the length of a resume? Because I know I still try to get my resume to be 1 page, although now I think I can't do it anymore, really, if I want to keep it super, complete. But for these law jobs, should you really just have the 1-pager? Is that still the best thing to do?
I think for most people, obviously, if you're in the middle of your career, different. But if you're a few years out of college and you've had a couple of jobs, there's absolutely no reason for your resume to be more than a page, and you should definitely cut it. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, if it's too short, as we talked about, you just have to beef it up. Give more explanation, more detail. You don't just line item that you were, head of the a cappella group. You go ahead and explain in 3 or 4 sentences exactly what your bullet points, whatever, exactly what you did. Also brainstorming anything else that you could possibly include, or just taking on more activities. And activities in law school could be something as simple as, being on the board of a club. Like, how hard is it to be the secretary of the Entertainment Law Society? Come on, right?
It's true.
No, I was on the board of 4 organizations as a 1L, because they're just looking for people who will show up to meetings. So it could be a really low time commitment sort of thing. The other thing you could think about is sometimes you see opportunities from organizations like Miss JD or something, to be an intern for them a few hours a week doing social media, or, think of all these ways that you can get a little bit experience that doesn't take a lot of time, but something to put on your resume.
What about blogging opportunities that come up? Ms. JD is the Writers in Residence program.
What about those, Lee?
Huh?
I said, what about blogging opportunities? we would never be looking for law school bloggers, would we?
No. But, if you, say, wanted to be a guest blogger on a blog like the Law School Toolbox, is that something that you could use on your resume to also beef up your presence?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, Miss JD has a Writers in Residence program that's a little more formal, where they like a commitment of a year. Something totally worth looking into. It's a low time cost opportunity, but also just reaching out to us. We are always interested in having law students write about their experiences. And this does not have to be a 300-page book. We're talking under 1,000 words, basically about what I'm learning as a 1L. But yeah, something like that looks great on a resume, because it shows some sort of ambition. It shows some sort of, getting out of the box of just going to classes.
And the other thing is, I think it helps with the Google searching, because that's something that most of these hiring folks will do as part of the hiring process. Is they're going to Google you.
Right. And I think that brings up a really great other point, which is that LinkedIn is essentially your resume at this point. So in addition to having a resume and cover letter, you need to have a LinkedIn profile that is reflective of where you are in your legal career.
And make sure they match, please.
Yes. Make sure they are the same. Consistency across everything. If you have an about.me page and you have information about yourself on that page, and you have a LinkedIn profile, and you have a resume, all of that material should be consistent.
Ooh, what about one of our favorite things to talk about are headshots? If you're going to have a LinkedIn profile, should you have a headshot?
I think you need to have a headshot, and it needs to look professional, and it should not be of you holding a martini glass in college.
Right. It should, even if you have recently gotten out of college, put on a suit jacket and have someone with their iPhone take a picture of you standing outside.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be super fancy. It doesn't have to be a studio, but think about right before sunset is a nice time to take pictures outside, because everyone looks great.
Yeah.
You just need decent lighting, decent hair, decent jacket, something that looks, again, it looks like you tried. It looks like you look professional.
I am shocked at how many law students send me invitations to be LinkedIn connections, and they are using headshots clearly from weddings or social events. Please do not do that. Please, please, please. I just have to say it again because we see it all the time.
Yeah, we should probably do a whole other episode on LinkedIn because I have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, okay. That's a teaser.
Yeah, a teaser. Unfortunately, we are out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes because we would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or alison@lawschooltoolbox.com. Or you can always contact us via our website contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening. We'll talk soon, and good luck with your job hunt.